This is Breaking Analysis with Dave Vellante.
Much of the AI industry is chasing the wrong prize. Frontier model vendors like Anthropic and OpenAI, they may have shifted their commercial focus toward enterprise customers, but they've not changed their fundamental architecture. Specifically, they're still trying to concentrate ever more intelligence inside a generalized model. And we agree with Ali Ghodsi that the practical definition of AGI has actually been achieved. Now, moving the goalpost to superintelligence, or what we've called Messiah AGI in a prior breaking analysis, does little to create differentiation for enterprise customers. The real prize, as we see it, is what we call enterprise AGI. Now, what do we mean by that? Specifically, we're talking about intelligence that is unique to and owned by each enterprise. Enterprise AGI is all about harmonizing proprietary data, business processes, policies, and this tacit human knowledge that we talk about a lot on breaking analysis, and then turning those artifacts into persistent assets over which models and agents can reason and ultimately act. The frontier model is definitely an important ingredient in all this equation, but the enterprise system of intelligence, what we call the SOI, we often refer to as its ontology or digital twin, is the linchpin of achieving what we're calling enterprise AGI, and that's where true business value comes from for enterprises. Now, this is distinct from data communism. We've used that term before. Data communism is where everyone consumes essentially the same embedded intelligence. We're advocates of data capitalism. We're data capitalists, if you will, in which each company controls, governs, and advances its own differentiated intelligence. So welcome to this week's Breaking Analysis. In this episode, George Gilbert and I are going to build on our previous works and further discuss the implications of what we heard at Databricks Data and AI Summit and put these findings in the context of our framework. And we're going to discuss it in detail. The point of this opening visual here, Alex, if you bring up the first slide, Sam Altman, this is George's wonderful creation, and George, I'm going to ask you to chime in. Sam Altman here is Wile E. Coyote racing past the enterprise opportunity, and he's off the superintelligence cliff. Meanwhile, Ali Ghodsi and Satya Nadella, they're like the roadrunner. They're watching from the edge of the cliff, and they're smirking. And this joke should send a message to the entire industry that Databricks, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Snowflake, and other enterprise SaaS players who could also be on that cliff, they're competing in a different race, and they're trying to own the system of intelligence layer that connects enterprise data, business meaning, and agent analysis, and so, or agent actions, sorry. And in this breaking analysis, George and I are going to define what we mean by enterprise AGI. We're going to look at Databricks' latest moves through the lens of our system of intelligence, that framework that we've been talking about for weeks and months and over a year now. We're going to assess the maturity of the Databricks Genie Ontology, which they furthered this past week, and explain how this emerging architecture could reshape the enterprise software market. George, welcome. Great job conceptualizing the opening graphic. Where did you come up with that idea? And
well,
the LLMs.
I mean, everyone grows up with Wile E. Coyote, the Roadrunner, and the rest of the cartoons. And this was just meant to capture the idea that, racing off for this super intelligence Messiah AGI is like, at some point they're gonna realize they're way out over their skis, and that the real prize is doing the hard work that, frankly, Palantir pioneered, which is connecting the proprietary data and processes and asset knowledge and turning that into an asset that agents can reason over and act, and that all these assets become guardrails that allow agents to take actions, but that they're also the orchestration, the orchestration platform that allows agents and humans to achieve collective outcomes. That you can't do that with just siloed models alone.
Well, in our opening, we talked about data communism. So I want to sort of go back to that idea, Alex, if you bring up slide 2. George, this is something you introduced to our audience last year. So here we show Sam Altman, Alex Wang, and Karl Marx. And idea is that the world's best intelligence should be absorbed into ever smarter models and then distributed back to everyone. So this common intelligence layer, well, sounds great and would be very powerful. It means that every enterprise gets access to essentially the same capabilities. And so this is a nuance that the market is perhaps missing. And this distinction, we think the market is, maybe not quite thinking through. I mean, we're selling a frontier model to the enterprise. It's not the same as creating enterprise intelligence. George, you were just talking about that. So that distinction is pretty central to our thesis. So walk us through why, in your opinion, that concentrating more intelligence in the model might be the wrong architecture for enterprise AGI.
So, okay, it was just to explain where this came from. The germ of the philosophy came out in a comment Alex Wang made on the No Priors podcast in late 2024, where he said, I think the world's smartest people should contribute their reasoning traces to the frontier models for the benefit of mankind, which, I read as Karl Marx saying, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. And that sounded, like data communism. But there's a germ of truth in there, which is when you look at what what Alex Wang was referring to, reasoning traces. The first couple generations of these frontier models were trained just on internet data. In other words, freely available data that everyone had. But when he's talking about reasoning traces, he's saying, now, if we want to go into investment banking and be able to augment or automate what an investment banking analyst does for valuing an acquisition, they have to have an investment banking analyst generate like a world of what their world looks like and all the data and thought processes. And that's extremely expensive, extremely narrow and specialized. And it's the same then for everyone. It's bottled up and it's the same. And our belief is that essentially you went from a business model where you were training on your data, everyone's data for free, to where you're essentially buying ever more specialized and sophisticated data, but it's the same for everyone. Now there is synthetic data for coding and math, and that's a separate issue. But again, this goes back to all the intelligence in one, Messiah AGI model.
Okay, thank you for that. So now the alternative to data communism is what we're calling data capitalism. We're data capitalists, as I said. So if you think about the frontier models, again, they're fundamental. But if you have this generalized intelligence and it's broadly available, that really doesn't help organizations differentiate. That the competitive advantage for firms comes from data and processes that are unique. They're proprietary data, they're tacit knowledge. They capture that. They're able to govern it the way they want it. They can follow their own corporate edicts. These become corporate assets. And so this emerging AI software stack that we bring up a lot is going to be familiar to viewers of Breaking Analysis. Alex, if you bring up slide 3, it shows the key pieces of the puzzle. And I'll stress again that the value we think really is going to concentrate at the system of intelligence. That's data. You got data platforms, you got systems of record. Those are important. They tell us kind of what happened. The system intelligence is that digital representation of an enterprise. It's this live digital model that addresses. It's the state of the enterprise. Not only why did something happen, but what happened. Why did something happen? What's likely to happen? And really importantly, what's the next best action? What should we do next? And then the system of agency takes over and enables agents to act with that intelligence. And the system of engagement is this new work surface that we talked about in our last episode that connects sort of the people and their intent to the outcomes, and it interacts with the system of intelligence. So George, you've been developing this framework. I know you've been working with Jeffrey Moore. Walk us through why the SOI is the critical layer, how it turns enterprise context into so-called proprietary advantage. What's missing whether it's the LLM vendors, the SaaS players, the data platform companies, the hyperscalers, what are they going to have to address?
Okay, so the reason we've been focused on this system of intelligence for so long is when we had the last industrial revolution, steel and autos, mass production, you had these enormous fixed assets, and that was the value of the firm and the industrial organization and the structure of each industry was determined by these enormous fixed assets, and the organizations that grew up to manage them, the hierarchies were about managing them efficiently. But the revolution that we're going through now is really another sort of knowledge worker and management revolution. And it's not these big fixed assembly lines, but it's this representation of your business. And there's this big myth and an argument going on that agents are going to allow us to have, these billion-dollar firms managed by one person. And I think that there's another perspective here, which is that you want this. You're actually going to see much, much larger enterprises along the lines of Amazon dominating one or many industries because they have the substrate that allows humans and agents to perform collective actions, in the sense that you have in the substrate the ability to do planning, control, organizing, coordination, resource allocation. Those are critical functions of management, and they're basically not in the notion of having one person with many agents. That's personal productivity and task productivity, but there's not the organizational alignment and output, collective outcomes. That's like all of economic history has been towards more complex forms of economic organization. And I think we're moving towards another step function, and that this stack that we were talking about is what allows basically this digital intelligence and human intelligence to organize in much larger scales than was possible before. That we've talked about. Now, what Dave, you and I learned at Snowflake and Databricks was the criticality of the co-design between the system of engagement, the new client, this intelligent agentic client, and the system of intelligence on the back end, that we didn't, I think, fully realize how deeply they needed to be co-designed at first, because the system of intelligence, as we really learned from Snowflake and Databricks, at least in the initial stages, is going to be authored much more by inference and learning from the bottom up, and not as much top down. And this has been an old debate in the enterprise. How much can you intergalactically model, top down, and how much has to be bottom up? And, if it's bottom up, you can get silos. If it's all top down, it'll take forever, and the enterprise has moved on. But what we saw from both Snowflake and Databricks, and we're going to go into this, is how far we can go with bottom up that we didn't realize before. And then what we're going to talk about later is how that's going to have to change to take us to the next level.
Yeah, it's interesting listening to you talk about the physical assets. There's in the New York Stock Exchange, where we have our new studio, there's up on the 6th floor, there's what's called the map room. When you go into the map room, back in the 18th century, when you went public, you had to map where your physical assets were. So things like railroads and manufacturing facilities and warehouses, those were placed on a map because that's where your assets were. They were physical assets. And, presumably organizations, companies organized around that. And of course, in the 20th and the 21st century, we've been organized around human labor and hierarchies of people. And increasingly, we think organizations are going to be, structured around intelligence, and that's how they're going to be able to scale without labor. And, agents are going to be supporting that. So, okay, so quick aside, but now let's to your point about Snowflake and Databricks, let's map our enterprise intelligence framework into what we saw at Databricks Data and AI Summit. Alex, bring up slide 4. And as you see, the story here, it's not just a bunch of product announcements. There were a lot of those, but you've got Databricks moving up from data infrastructure, and we saw this several weeks ago at Snowflake as well, into the new layers, the system of engagement, the intelligence layer, and of course the agency layers. So Genie is Databricks agentic client, and the Genie Ontology, which we're going to dig into, is this emerging, evolving system of intelligence layer. AgentBricks they announced that I think last year, starts to operationalize that intelligence. And then Omnigen is this new open source, it's Databricks open source harness that Matei went through at the conference. Think of it as an open source version of tools like Codex from OpenAI or Claude Code or Claude Cowork. And now the key question is how these pieces are going to reinforce one another, learning from users, the reasoning traces of users, other applications, the governed data, and learning how an enterprise actually operates. Alex, if you bring back that slide, and George, walk us through the mapping and where Databricks is differentiated versus where the stack is still sort of emerging.
Okay, so let me start with the clients, what we were calling the system of engagement. These are the intelligent clients. These are the genies. The first one is Genie 1, which is for business users, and we're going to step through that one in a little more detail. It's not just dashboards, but it's a way to connect business users to the assets that across the enterprise, but it's anchored in business data, and we'll explain why that's important. And this is comparable to Claude's Cowork, Microsoft 365 Cowork, and what's going to be merged, ChatGPT and Codex, because they're going to merge those products, and also Snowflake Cowork, and then they're the other genies, like one for code, one for zero ops, and it knows that one, for instance, how to build and maintain assets in the Databricks environment. Code knows how to build, say, data pipelines in the Databricks environment. The reason I bring them up is these have been trained, that these models have been what's called post-trained in the Databricks environment. So it understands the Databricks world, and just the way they understand the Databricks world. And so they can be more effective with less supervision and less knob tuning. The same way when an enterprise builds their system of intelligence in the Genie Ontology, which is, you'll see right going through the center of that slide, that Genie Ontology is how every enterprise starts to build their own world so that their business agents can navigate through the map. That ontology is a map that's particular to every enterprise. And then we're going to go into that one in some detail, because that's the early makings of a digital twin. And then the system of agency, there's really two components. As you alluded to, there's AgentBricks, which is becoming a very advanced agent development platform. Like even last year, the OpenAI folks were talking about its sophistication and governance, combination of Unity's AI gateway and the Unity catalog, and we're going to go into both of those. Those would fit in our top layer of this system of agency. And again, just to fit the pieces together, the system of intelligence is the map. And so all the Genie clients know how to navigate based on that map, which is like the ontology and Unity. And then governance is how you control what's allowed. And we're not going to go into, there were some significant announcements at the data layer, but we're not going to go into this as much. The reason it's just that the data layer is becoming the equivalent of like hardware infrastructure. And the platform, the ontology, digital twin or system intelligence, that's the new platform layer. And then the agents are the new application layer. And so that's where we're going to focus on the upper layers.
Yeah, Ali Goetze, early on in his day one keynote, I thought did a really good job. He brought out Ryan Blue, somebody we had on Breaking Analysis a couple of years ago before the Databricks acquisition. And he made the point, to your last point about we're not really going to go deep into the data infrastructure. Ali made the point is we got to stop talking about, we've moved beyond, all the different formats, and Ryan Blue made the point is customers shouldn't have to think about what format it is. It should just be there. And so we are moving, beyond that and up the stack, and that's just a sign of progress. But what I want to do is go back to where you started with focus on the system of engagement. And Alex, bring up slide 5, please. So Genie 1 is Databricks, the business user sort of agentic client. To think of it as a data-aware coworker, that has intelligence in it. So it's got dashboards, it's got Genie spaces, it's got apps, and obviously it's governed data. So it brings us all into a common workspace or experience. A number of organizations are trying to go after this. So it might look like a kind of new way to interact with analytic data, which of course is a strong suit of Databricks, but we think this is key because it's where the users are going to express their intent. They're going to ask questions. They're going to resolve conflicts. And these are signals that can ultimately make the intelligence backend smarter. So George, give us the product level view of Genie 1, why it's important that owning the business user experience, as we sort of connected post Snowflake Summit, why that's so important to the broader enterprise AGI thesis that we're laying out here.
Okay, so it, like a year ago, it was a way to access BI assets like dashboards, but that's expanding, beyond the visualizations to Databricks apps, things that these are applications built on Databricks and shared to other users. You can get to the data assets themselves. You can share metrics and semantic objects like measures. These are measures and business definitions. You can share notebooks and queries. That's stage one. Then there's external assets that'll come over time. And this is where the ontology has to mature so that Databricks creates a map of how all these other external assets are connected. And now their aspiration is you have local files that get uploaded into Genie spaces, like they could be Excel that is blended with Unity catalogs. There's documents and unstructured content that's indexed from your SharePoint or Google Drive or Confluence or Glean. Now, this is very hard to do. And their secret sauce is the fact that they have ground truth data, which is gold data assets, like verified data assets, like a dashboard, where everyone agrees this is a source of truth. It's very hard to build an index where not everyone agrees what's the core thing you want to link everything to. And we're going to go into how they do that and how they learn it. And it's going to be hard also, but they want to connect also SaaS applications. They have 80 plus connectors now, but actually building those into the ontology like Salesforce, SAP, and mapping them, that's going to be hard. Just saying we have a connector is one thing, but having Genie 1 know that customer in this system maps to a customer in that system, and under what conditions, you can extend credit, or how to measure some metric that everyone wants to agree on across systems. That's going to take a little more advancement, but you can see the germ of this map being built.
Yeah, 80 plus connectors is, it's a feat in and of itself. Ali Goetze said, he made the point, it's not just, your Gmail and your Slack and the Salesforce. It's, other deeper tools. And he challenged the audience, if we're missing one, let us know. But it is the first step. So Genie 1 is the business user surface. If you think about it, that entry into the system. But Databricks has, as George has alluded to, we think anyway, a much broader ambition. Of course it does. It's got, high value, large market cap, private company, but and one that we're excited to see go public someday. Alex, bring up slide 6 if you would, and those watching can see the company is extending its intelligence and its data aware coworkers across a number of different roles. So developers, data engineers, analysts, app builders, agent creators, and giving them access to tools where those people already work. The key point here, as George said last week, there are more agents and co-pilots than fleas on a camel's back. What's more interesting is that these role-specific experiences that Databricks is going after, they could potentially draw from, contribute back to that same governed enterprise. So not just connecting to them, it's gleaning that intelligence and that context being shared and accessible across the enterprise. This is how the system of engagement begins to reinforce the intelligent back end. So George, walk us through sort of the different genies, why this role-based approach, is so important to the broader architecture, and Alex, maybe keep the slide up and George, walk us through.
So let me riff and expand on that analogy you made, like that there are more agents and agent development tools than fleas on the average camel. What differentiates them is integrating them with the data and action space that's specific to a company. And that's what, once you have that Genie Ontology, that map, and unity sort of between the two, you have a company specific environment or platform or world, whatever word you want to use. And then those agents understand how your company works. And so you have, as we mentioned before, like Genie code, so you can build Databricks applications or Databricks data pipelines, zero ops. It understands the environment, so it understands, let's say, if there's a problem with a pipeline, it knows how to diagnose it and remediate or suggest remediation. So in other words, these are for developers or for DevOps folks. Then you would have agents similarly for data scientists that understand the metrics that exist. And then it makes it much easier to do the developing traditional ML models because it's already working on predefined metrics. And then again, back to Genie 1, but they're all building on this same emerging platform of Unity Catalog and the Genie Ontology. And then the other branch is that it connects to everything. It connects to your data assets, the governed metric definitions, it connects to, through the connectors, all those federated applications, the SaaS apps, unstructured data, which we talked about. So that's one branch, all the things you connect to. And then the third branch is you can access it from anywhere, like whether you're in ChatGPT or Claude or Microsoft Copilot. And we're going to talk about some of the limitations of, where you can access it, and also Slack, mobile. But the key is they really want that Genie 1 experience to be pervasive, because as we're going to get into, that's critical. That surface area is critical for learning this virtuous cycle between the client and the ontology, for both of them to get smarter together.
Well, and a lot of companies want their version of Genie to be ubiquitous. You certainly, I'm sure Snowflake coming at it from its, position of strength, Databricks, the Amazon with Quick, clearly Google has aspirations. Microsoft is ubiquitous. Of course, the LLM vendors as well, all the SaaS vendors, everybody has their own sort of designs. So let's get into the heart of the intelligent backend. Alex, if you bring up slide 7, we're looking here at the Genie Ontology. This is where Databricks starts turning data into, shared enterprise meaning and context, to, connecting business terms, the language of the business, the metrics, the data sources, expertise, so that agents can operate from, be trusted and operate in a governed manner versus, rows and columns of raw data. So our thinking is that Databricks' current strength is this semantic harmonization, helping the organizations agree, and this is newish, helping organizations agree on what the data actually means. That's a big step toward a true system of intelligence, but it's still not a digital model of how the enterprise operates, George. But it's really, this is the crux of the framework. Walk us through what Genie Ontology does today, why it's strategically important, and where the current gaps exist.
Okay, so to be really precise, like we have to acknowledge, like a year ago, or even 2 years ago, when I think we started talking about the system of intelligence, we assumed it was going to be authored somehow top down, and they would be packaged solutions, and there will be islands like the Salesforce Data Cloud or SAP Business Data Cloud, Celonis, relational AI. But what was the big revelation from Databricks and Snowflake was that some amount of this could be authored bottom up, or not authored, learned and inferred bottom up. And the way it's built is that there, right now it collects like metric definitions. And it's a map of your data and the business. Things like authoritative sources. Revenue should be pulled from this particular finance table. An active user is a distinct user that's deduped across all platform. Now, where it's going to get much harder is when you have to encode things like a qualified lead only counts once a demo is booked. That we're going to explain when the business rules about how a business process works have to get encoded. That's going to get harder to learn. But just to explain why owning the ontology is so critical, just a couple of weeks ago, it came out that Microsoft blocked Databricks Unity metrics from being consumed in Power BI. And it would seem Microsoft's excuse was, well, consistency. We want to make sure that, we don't have metrics defined in Power BI that are different from Unity. The reality is that map, the business definitions are so important that you can generate the dashboard if you own the definitions, meaning you can throw out Power BI and in the age of Gen AI, when you have Genie spaces and things like that, you generate the visualization. You don't author it in Power BI. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to make sure that the definitions that they have in Power BI get pushed out into their fabric, their lake, and then that they become the authoritative source of definitions. Because if Databricks becomes the authoritative source, then Power BI is no longer necessary.
Now, a key question is how this ontology gets built, stays current. So when you think about traditional semantic layers that, as George is saying, developed top down, and that was kind of our initial thinking, is that that's how these would be developed. As George alluded to, Databricks trying to do this much more from gather the business context from a bottoms up perspective. So let me just sort of summarize what that means. It's interpreting context from, think about queries. There's specific vocabulary that's used. There are generally accepted correct answers within an enterprise. There are corrections from conflicts. There's other behavioral signals that, from a bottoms-up perspective, can be interpreted and inferred. So the system can presumably, rank that knowledge based on things like provenance or data quality, how recent the data is, how often that data is accessed, as indicators. So this is why copilots, I can use that term, it probably wouldn't like me using that term, but intelligent, agents like Genie, it's more than just a user interface. That's in part what it is, but there's teaching input for the intelligent backend. So George, or Alex, bring up slide 8, and George, Walk us through this graphic showing how the sort of Genie ontology learns.
Okay, so it's learning partly from human artifacts and partly from what's going on in the server, like behavioral exhaust. So the combination is that's behavioral exhaust, and that it's inferring the meaning of like people and resources and how they're connected to each other and the measures, the BI metrics. But then when it's not sure, it asks, and I'll explain. But as you were explaining before, it's looking at a whole bunch of snippets that it's getting from tables and queries and things like that. And then it's using a PageRank type algorithm, as you were saying, to weigh authorship, authority, usage frequency, freshness, and linkage to certified assets. And that all these things were critical because they help you derive ground truth, like what's the real asset. And that's where so many other products that are trying to build a knowledge graph of how an enterprise works run into trouble because they can't find that ground truth. And so the critical part is this solves the context problem without hand curation. And the idea is it learns, as I was saying, bottom up, but there's some human in the loop to specify or choose, and you elaborate with examples. So as I was saying, people and resources, how they're connected, and measures. What doesn't work as easily is rules that define a business process. These are things like what must happen or what must not happen. And the key thing there is that means this bottom-up philosophy where you infer the ontology is going to need to evolve significantly and to become much more sophisticated if they want the ontology to get more advanced. And we're going to elaborate on that in a future slide. But the key thing is that it's mostly learned, and then it's asking the human for clarification. And that's the key takeaway. It's not top-down authored and specified.
Well, let's take a look at an example, Alex. If we bring up slide 9, this is an example of the learning loop in its simple form, but a user asks a question in it's using the company's specific language. What do you mean by platinum customer? And, it doesn't guess. Genie recognizes that it's opaque. So it's asking the user for clarification. And then the answer to which becomes reusable enterprise context for future users and agents. It gets sort of, learned. And this is why the agentic client is so important. It's a teaching tool. And George, this might seem trivial to a lot of observers, this example, but walk us through, that example that we showed and where the system is asking for that clarification, learning bottom up by inferring and creating that loop. Where does this work well? Where does it hit a wall?
The example shows like exactly as you said. So it's the ontology is not sure when the user says, "Show me revenue from platinum customer segment." The ontology is not 100% sure what's the definition of a platinum customer segment. So it needs to be able to get to the user interface and ask that question. And so then in this case, the business user types in platinum customers are accounts that generated over 10,000 in revenue in any given month. And that's that critical piece where if Databricks does not own the business client, it's very hard to get that clarifying question where it gets the human in the loop to learn what it doesn't know. That was the critical part of that piece. And that's why Snowflake needs a business user client. That's why Microsoft is so doggedly working on 365 Copilot, because otherwise, in their case, not only will their will their different Fabric IQ, Work IQ, Knowledge IQ not evolve with user input, but their very core Office applications could become sort of like little tool applets, because now this new surface, we talked about this, I think a couple months back, there's going to be a new editable surface that becomes the center of gravity for the smart agentic client. That's what we're witnessing, the emergence here. And so every vendor is fighting for that, because not only does that define how all the other tools interact with it, but it is how you can capture all the smarts that train your backend.
Yep. And we saw last week at AWS NYC Summit, the Amazon going after, they've basically taken Q for business and Q for developers, and, you know, and turned it into quick, Q, its whole Q product line. And it looks like it's a much stronger, better product. They want to, you know, own that piece. Unclear how their back end system of intelligence comes together, but very clearly they understand that there needs to be that capability. It's unclear to us how they get there. But to save that for another day. Now, up to this point, we've shown how Genie Ontology learns. Alex, if you bring up slide 10, because it puts Genie Ontology's current capabilities and lays it onto this maturity curve that George has refactored here. So the assessment is that Databricks sits roughly between levels 5 and 6. So you can see right there at the transition point from what we're calling diagnostic intelligence toward agent coordination. So the governing principle is, we talked about this last week or the last breaking analysis, the richer and more accurate the enterprise data model becomes, that makes the analytics more sophisticated, and it broadens the scope and confidence for agent action. So George, this is your maturity model. Walk us through the higher levels, what Databricks has to add to evolve from a semantic knowledge layer into this truly operational system of intelligence. And Alex, maybe keep the slide here, and George, have at it.
So you hit the core of it, which is the richer your model of the business, the more sophisticated the analytics, and just we can go up, you know, at the very bottom, there's, you know, your traditional siloed reports. You might have customer living in multiple different applications. And so it's hard to ask questions like, how many deals did this customer represent this quarter? It's only in one system. And the best you can do is print a report. Now, without going through all the layers, where Databricks is able to get with their ontology, we believe is somewhere between 5 and 6, where you might be able to say, okay, this customer has a churn risk of X%, and then you might be able to ask a question, which is like, why? What is contributing to the churn risk? And then the actionability would be, okay, so shift some sales coverage, and it's likely to yield this much more business from this B2B customer. But again, this is, if you want to get to higher confidence levels so that agents can take over more of the actions and the analytics are more sophisticated, this ontology has to get richer. And at level 6, you basically connect people and resources with, you have typed relationships. So you can say, what's the best path to reach this investor? And an agent can act on that intent with these narrow governed rules. The goal that we've been talking about for a long time is this real-time digital twin, where the ontology is not querying all these operational systems for the live state of the business, but the digital twin becomes the system of truth itself. And then you can say in one place, what's happening right now? And analyzing is equivalent to operating, and that the agents, they don't have to have this master coordinator, but the agents can coordinate off the live shared state of the business. And a level beyond that is where agents can plan and optimize, and humans just set the goals. And the point of walking through this is everyone's trying to move toward these higher maturity levels. And the reason we brought this up is for Databricks Genie Ontology to get beyond the level that it's at now, it can't just learn inference. There's going to have to be more teaching and hand authoring and governance involved. There's going to have to be a much heavier human in the loop involved. That was the key point of trying to explain where we are in the maturity model and then what has to come next.
And Ali even mentioned, which was new to me. You may have known this, you may have mentioned it before. They have forward deployed engineers on staff, helping customers, and that seems to be sort of this model. And we're unpacking the bridge from descriptive ontology to one that is executable by agents. And the glue is this human knowledge, these forward deployed AI engineers. Now, the bottom-up learning can expose, things like structure, organizational parlance. It can monitor recurring patterns. But these behaviors in and of themselves, as George is sort of alluding to, can't tell the system what has to happen next. It can't tell the system what you can't do, and which policies are more important than the other ones. I mean, maybe it can do that to some extent, but as George is saying, to reach these higher maturity levels, you got to tap into local skills. There's other signals, and then that has to turn into operating logic, and it's got to be exposed as enterprise assets that can be shared, obviously governed. Alex, bring up slide 11, and George, walk us through the three layers that you're showing here and why Databricks is going to need this hybrid bottom-up, top-down model to move beyond that sort of dividing line between levels 5 and level 6 that you showed on the previous slide.
Okay, this is going to sound, it's going to confuse maybe some people where we've got new layers. We've got 3 layers now, which is that the Genie Ontology basically got you through in this slide, layer 1, which is the basic structure of the business. These are the key business objects, customers, orders, and how they connect, and the levels of detail and the shared naming. But when you want to add the operating logic, the business rules, it's much harder than to just ask someone to clarify their meaning. What's harder now is you have to capture things like what must happen or what must not happen, those as examples. And it's much harder to see that invisible stuff in behavioral exhaust. So we think one way of doing this in the spirit of bottom-up contribution is for people to contribute the skills that they build on their personal agents. Because remember, what the big revelation this year is that agents aren't growing from workflows. They're really growing on personal productivity. And as people author these personal productivity skills, the way that we see this evolving is you can contribute these skills that are authored, and then there'll be like an LLM that might abstract them and find which ones conflict, and then present them to a governance committee. That's where the human in the loop is now. Instead of a business user clarifying, there'll be a governance committee that'll say, it'll take all these proposed harmonized skills and turn them into business logic. But a governance committee says, these ones look right, these ones are approved. And so the ontology now can start accumulating the business process rules and tacit knowledge that you couldn't quite capture just from asking a business user to clarify a metric definition. that's how we think we're going to get to the next layers of the ontology.
So you can see this is not trivial. This is why we often say it's going to take the better part of a decade for this to all play out. Now, I just have to mention, again, topic for another break analysis, because David Floyer would say this is all too complicated for mainstream enterprises. The LLMs have to become much more functional, and that's sort of a debate that we can have, how far the LLMs can go. We suggested in our first slide with Sam Altman flying off the cliff that they're not really even focused on the capabilities that are needed that George is laying out. Others in our team, David Floyer in particular, believes that they ultimately will get there. So we're going to park that for another day. But let's bring it back to Omnigen, kind of a cool name. Matei announced this at Databricks, did the deep dive on it. I guess Ali announced it last week. It's an open source harness. It can connect third-party clients, agentic clients like coding assistants or enterprise copilots into the Unity AI gateway. That's where the enterprise can apply common access controls, policies, can cost things out, et cetera. So the benefit is it's the perfect storm, right? Or perfect, balance of openness, but you still got governance. Unity catalog, Databricks stresses is open source. Of course, Snowflake has a different approach. They've got sort of, the proprietary Horizon. They're connecting that to the Polaris open source. So kind of interesting debates there. But the open question is whether those external clients can contribute the same sort of interaction signals that native Genie experiences use to improve that ontology. So it's one thing if you've got like an integrated, co-design, and you control all that. But that's what we're going to sort of dig into here. Alex, bring up slide 12. And George, how does Omnigen and the gateway fit into the system of agency? And when talking about what Databricks gains, or loses when someone else owns that user experience.
Okay, so you set it up great, which is that Omnigen is a harness that sits around other agents' harnesses, so that if you're using someone else's system of engagement, like Claude Cowork or Codex from OpenAI, the merged Codex and ChatGPT, or Microsoft 365 Copilot, how do you govern all those clients? This is how do you bring essentially the emerging heterogeneous client landscape back into a governed enterprise landscape? And Omnigen is a way of sitting around those harnesses and then tying them back into the Unity catalog and the Unity AI gateway. The distinction is it can treat all your models, agents, skills, and telemetry as governed assets. You can put permissions around models. Critically, you can capture observability, and this sounds arcane, but observability is really critical. It's going to be, we believe, the equivalent of how clickstreams defined the era of big data. You take the traces of agent reasoning, and then you can diagnose problems and remediate. And at the same time, those traces then become the basis of your learning loop, how you improve your agents. And it's an enormous amount of data. It's 10 to 100, maybe even 1,000 times greater data volume than we collected with, Datadog with traces for, microservices. And it also captures things like durable execution, which Databricks introduced, which is like a source of truth for the agent reasoning in an asynchronous long-running process. If it fails, can you roll it back? Now that's going to be, like with databases, it took a long time to get that right. I think it's not a check mark. This is again a maturity process. How do you make sure agents executing a process over hours or days, if they fail, can recover? They announced a product there. I think it's again a journey. It's not a full deliverable. And I think the same may be true with observability. But the point here is Omnigen allows you to harness, pun intended, all those third-party agents into all this richness in the back end. What I don't believe it gets you is the ability to have the ontology push a question, a clarification to this third-party client and say, you were asking our system this, and we need a clarification, spell out what you mean. I don't think you can do that through Omnigen. I got conflicting answers from different people. So I suspect the answer is we can administer the third-party agents and clients, but we can't get the same essentially semantic feedback from that would refine the ontology that you can get from, say, Genie 1, from the native client.
So a couple of points here I want to just pick up on is your point about recovery. It gives new meaning to business continuity and business resilience because you're talking about recovering the state of an enterprise. So not just its data, but where it was in the process, and what the intent was of that process, where they were in the reasoning cycle. That's pretty complicated. And I would imagine we talked about this and, with Veeam and, its use of the term context. Ultimately, there will be sort of, we think, the equivalent of data protection for this new form of business resilience that captures the state of the enterprise at any, some one given granular snapshot of that business. The other point is just the history of the technology industry, with some exceptions, shows that you're going to have fragmentation, and it seems like we're headed in the same direction as you have powerful players trying to grab value and deliver value for clients. Customers make bets on certain platforms, and that ultimately leads to silos and fragmentation. And you can see this developing, fragmentation of intelligence within different SaaS platforms, people betting on, LLMs, David Floyer's scenario, let the LLMs do the work, data platforms, people coming at it from Databricks and Snowflake, and others. The hyperscalers have their own designs, which, in many cases are quite fragmented, and you have different parts of the organization making different bets. So it kind of leads to this multiple systems of intelligence. But let's zoom out from here, back, hit the escape key from just Databricks and look at the broader competitive landscape. It's a good entry for that. Alex, bring up slide 13. We show how many of the major players, this is just a subset, are entering and where they're entering from different positions. You got frontier labs and co-pilots coming through the system of engagement. Again, folks like David Floyer believe the frontier labs are going to go after that system of intelligence. I'm quite convinced myself they'll be going after it. I think they have to. There doesn't seem to be signs that they understand what we've been talking about today, just in terms of building out that system of intelligence. But my guess is they'll eventually figure it out, or already have, and just aren't talking about it. You got data platform players that are coming, through governed enterprise data, SaaS and process vendors with system of record and operational process, like Celonis, but they're all converging on the control point, the highest value piece of real estate in this stack, which is the system of intelligence, the SOI. And that's where the enterprise's data, its business logic, its skills all become reusable corporate assets in a governed way. We've talked about this debate in our community, is how capable the models are going to be, how much of the stack firms like OpenAI and Anthropic are going to be able to own. Will they, for example, be able to connect, to engagement, intelligence, and agency in this closed loop system that really understands how the business operates and take action through that? Again, I believe, George, they're going to want to try to do that. Whether or not they can, we'll see. Or maybe new players are going to emerge that can provide this capability. So there are going to be other partnerships that form that go after this prize. Friends are going to become enemies. You're seeing some of that with Satya's statements around the frontier model vendors. He's, clearly concerned about his relationship with OpenAI. George, take us through who is best positioned here, and it seems like a wide open jump ball. We use that a lot. Who's best positioned in this race? What each camp is missing to realize this vision?
So I think you set this up really well, which is that there are different vendors converging on this, and we're not going to emerge with one harmonized layer coming top down, because we know that never really happens. But what we do have, the starting point is that there are thousands of islands of operational apps, packaged apps, custom apps, and even the analytic data all lives in different islands. But the point of having the Salesforce Data Cloud, the SAP Business Data Cloud, Snowflake, and Databricks harmonizing all their assets means there are fewer islands, and then it's easier to bridge. Because if you go into if you go into Claude Cowork or OpenAI's Codex, ChatGPT right now, and you want to connect to the external world, you get this just list of connectors, this endless list of connectors. There's no map in there. And by having, for instance, all these vendors starting to unify some part of the estate, you're unifying, you're getting fewer islands. And if you have fewer islands, it's easier to bridge them, whether you put an overlay map on them or, have some sort of connection between them. And the evolution from last year is that last year we had Snowflake and Databricks down in the orange layer in the data platform at the very bottom. And we moved them up this year because they are now in the system of intelligence layer above. And now we've moved all the business intelligence clients out of the system of engagement, because you really need these new, more advanced agentic clients who are connected to backends to capture, through the human in the loop, some of the semantics that builds out the system of intelligence, which is all that we've been talking about with the ontology. I do agree with David Floyer that we're going to see the frontier vendors move into the system of intelligence, but the way it's going to happen, I think, is we're seeing it first where they capture memory and skills for each of the client agents, and memory becomes state and skills become logic. And then, but right now it's personal skills and personal memory. And then they'll have some way of trying to build workgroup memory and workgroup skills, and maybe some way of harmonizing them, so that they can be shared. And then they'll realize, well, we really need some advanced, essentially it's like a rules engine, any one of these platforms we've been talking about that can take logic and, the bottom-up skills, and some governance process where you harmonize them, and then you have a governance team in the loop. And I think they'll start moving in that direction where they build the models, these system of intelligence models. Anyway, the key point is that you can't build this enterprise AGI that we've been talking about unless you have both the LLMs to give you adaptive intelligence and the system of intelligence to give you the deterministic intelligence that's both the business rules and the tacit knowledge, which sort of takes over when there are no rules, when the rules break down or when the rules conflict, but you need both. And I don't think just having, this is where David Floyer and I disagree, I don't think just a very, very smart LLM can substitute for trying to capture your own business rules and tacit knowledge and treating them as a corporate asset.
And I'm not qualified to speak for Floyer, but just in speaking to him about this issue, I think one of the things that he would point out is volume matters. And when you think about who has the volume, it's clearly the 2 or 3 even leading foundation model players, Anthropic, OpenAI, and Google. We'll see about Grok, whether or not they participate, in Meta. And of course, Microsoft is obviously ubiquitous in a business context, but volume does matter. I see a lot of the agents and copilots out there are going to struggle to get to the type of volumes. And I think this is why OpenAI, I do see their consumer business as an advantage because of that volume and that brand affinity. And we'll see how this plays out. But let's talk about, we've been talking a lot about architecture and the technology. Best technology doesn't always win. We saw that, OS 2 versus Windows. So come back to volume. But anyway, let's talk about where architecture meets sort of economics. And Alex, bring up slide 14. We've shown this graphic before, George. This was something you and I showed at a previous breaking analysis, and it's something that you kind of conceptualized. Below the ice, you got the infrastructure. You got data platforms. You got data infrastructure, legacy software. These are important, but it's plumbing. And the economics are not nearly as attractive. Above the ice is where the differentiation is and where the value is greater, kind of up the stack. This digital twin of the enterprise, it's got its data, processes, the tacit knowledge, all combined with the system of engagement and agency that can learn and decide and act. The system of intelligence is at the heart of that. And that's where the pricing can begin to move from, software consumption models, seat-based models to outcomes, outcome-based pricing. The point is it's not that infrastructure goes away. It doesn't. The data becomes kind of the new hardware business, if you will. And the business process model becomes the platform and the agents become the applications. So, George, bring us home on what this split means for value capture, for pricing power, the future structure of the enterprise software industry, customers, big question, but give us your final thoughts.
Well, this was a framework that a friend at Neo4j pointed out to me, that every era has its infrastructure, its platform, and its applications. And people for the longest time have said data is the new oil, and then other people would argue, yeah, but data is not fungible. But the reality is now the value isn't really in the data so much as the model that makes the data actionable. And so, like, if you have this pyramid, data is like, what happened, and who it happened to, who was involved, and things like that. But the next layer up, the platform, which is the business process model, the system of intelligence that we've been talking about, that is the thing that gives you actionable intelligence, like based on what happened, I want to be able to figure out why, and then what's likely to happen, and then what should happen. That's in that platform layer. And this goes back to what we were talking about in the maturity of the ontology, or the digital twin. As you have more and more of that captured in the ontology, like why things happened, what should happen, then the agents can have more confidence in expressing or taking a wider range of actions. And it's not just a single agent, then all agents and humans can share the same coordination substrate, and you have in that substrate the signals that direct the collective outcomes of an organization. And that's where the value is. And then you get close to, you can measure the output of the work and the value of the work. And there's raging debates of, can we really get to outcome pricing? Because if you do that, then customers are paying you royalties on the product you're selling them. And there's questions, do customers really want to pay royalties? Because then you're embedded in their cost of goods sold. But if you can measure your contribution to the outcome, you are at least in a position to negotiate something closer to value-based pricing. And if you're below that platform layer, you are really just infrastructure, and you're still stuck in utility or consumption pricing.
Right, and that's a conversation that companies will want to have, that the former, not the latter. So
right.
All right, George. Amazing. Yet again, thank you for all the great thought, the slides, and to be continued. This is sort of the annual post Snowflake, Databricks conference season where we kind of connect the dots and put things into context. Tony Baer calls it Snowbricks, and every year both of these companies try to advance, and they do advance sort of the thinking. And as Ali Ghodsi said and emphasized in his keynote, we're really moving further up beyond debates about delta and iceberg and formats and open table formats, and really getting into the heart of AI. It's just a sign of the maturity. Again, George Gilbert, thank you so much. And thank you for watching this episode of Breaking Analysis. We'll see you next time.